Okay, can you all see that title screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we'll just get going. I am so grateful for you all joining us this evening. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm excited for some of our special guests, in particular, Daniel, who's joining us from Rhode Island, and Susie, who is joining us from California, to share with us a lot of the exciting work that they are doing. And as is the tradition, you know, I've taken up the habit of doing a fundraiser at the very end of the year. So this is ostensibly a fundraiser. However, it's really about a conversation for housing justice, which is why I'm here. And I'm so grateful to all of you for supporting the work that I've done and for leading on this fight in your specific ways. And I really wanted to start it with a specific quote, and it really hit me. It came at a time at the end of a long and challenging legislative session. And it was back in August. Bernie had just come from the floor of the United States Senate, where he put many economic justice provisions to votes during the Inflation Reduction Act fight. And he didn't get very far. He had, you know, really, I would say, come from the arena, taking on the lions of capitalism, if you will. And what he said was really simple, but I thought it was so profound. And, you know, he reminded us that the struggle is really about two things: that we have to convey and understand the reality, and we have to offer people a vision. And when he said the word vision, he really emphasized that. And he went on to say that, you know, when you turn on the news, you don't often get the reality, and you certainly never get a vision. You know, you don't turn on CNN and hear someone explaining, we're going to do this, 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 and this, and this, and then when we're done, everyone will have affordable housing. And he said, it's really, you know, up to us to offer that vision. No one's going to do it for us. And for me, you know, having led on these issues and having worked in partnership with so many of you on these issues, the vision has to be housing for all. And when I say housing for all, you know, you could say housing is a human right. You could say a guaranteed housing program, a universal housing program. But for me, there's really two parts to the idea of housing for all. You know, there's the basic part, which is that all people have housing. Family homelessness has doubled in our Commonwealth over the past decade. It's an absolute shame. We need housing first programs and wraparound services to get to functional zero homelessness. And then the other side of a housing for all vision is really that all piece in thinking about all of the different constituencies. And so often what I've found in this work is that, you know, we could be arguing for rent stabilization, we could be arguing for zoning reform, but there's so many other pieces of our constituencies that need attention and that need support. And so the hope is to get to a housing for all vision where we can really offer more things to more people. And I'm so excited to hear from some of our guests tonight about what that could look like. And so for me, you know, answering sort of the prompt that Bernie gave us when we met with him here in Cambridge back in August, you know, if we're honest about the reality, it's an ongoing emergency. The emergency's been ongoing in Cambridge now for over 20 years. It has no precedent in modern history. And then the vision is universal government-backed program of housing for all. And this notion that there is no precedent, it's starting to gain, I think, more recognition. This was recently published in the GBH Priced Out series, this quotation here. And it's so important to recognize that what we are witnessing on our streets, what we are witnessing under highways or down at Mass and Cass or in any community in our Commonwealth, it's not normal, it's not natural, it's the result of decades of policy choices, and it doesn't have any precedent in history. Things have never been this bad. I'm going to review some of the things I've covered in a recent presentation I did on this topic. And, for me, the vision really starts with my own background. This is where I grew up in Norwood, Mass. You can see here the public housing where I grew up. It was built and financed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in a little bit, we're going to hear from Daniel Denvir. And one of the big reasons why I wanted him to come join us from Rhode Island tonight is that in Rhode Island, there is a very active campaign for social housing. And, to me, social housing is a lot like public housing. I'm looking forward to Daniel to help us understand that difference and to hear a bit about what they're doing down there. I'm going to just quickly review for folks who haven't heard me talk about this before, just some of what I've done in the legislature. My first term, we worked on the housing bond bill. There's actually going to be another housing bond bill this year. So this is an incredible opportunity. And certainly my hope would be that that housing bond bill isn't just a bond bill. And by bond, we mean capital investment. But I hope there'll be a lot of policy, and I hope there'll be an opportunity to do a truly comprehensive housing bill. And I actually was on the phone this morning with Lieutenant Governor-elect Kim Driscoll. She spent close to an hour with me on the phone. And we were talking about rent stabilization, real estate transfer fees, housing first programs. LG-elect Driscoll actually stated to the Boston Globe yesterday that she believes housing is a human right. That's so important. That's step one. Let's make the statement. And then step two is let's make those words an actual reality. And I think not everyone on Beacon Hill will even agree to the statement. And I'm so psyched that we now have an administration that will use that language. And I think so much of what we need to do in the next 2 years is to make that language a reality. Moving on real quickly here, I'm going to talk a little bit. Some of you probably remember when we took up the governor's housing bill, I stood on the floor and I made a real call to say, we can't just deal with a bill that only tackles one piece of the problem. We need to really think comprehensively. We can't just do production. Production's needed. There needs to be tenant protections. There needs to be big public investment in affordable housing. That means new revenue. Certainly, the real estate transfer fee is an idea that's ready to go. There are even other ideas like taxes on large corporations, which we'll get into in a little bit. There's a HERO bill. There's really so much that we can look at. My second term in office, I actually introduced what could be described as the original Housing for All agenda. And you can probably see it here on your screen. And it really included everything from housing first programs to requiring multifamily zoning near transit, to lifting the statewide ban on rent control, to making big public investments in affordable housing. Can you hear my cat scratching on the door or no? Hold on, she's scratching, sorry. Here we go. Come on in. I don't know. She's not gonna come in now. And new progressive revenues. And so, I think certainly I'm interested to hear from our guests and to hear from all of you what you think we may have missed with this first iteration of a Housing for All agenda. But I think it's fair to say it's hard to find anywhere, even though we have so many people advocating for housing, it's hard to find any coalition or any particular agenda that really meets all of these elements, from dealing with homelessness to production to protections to revenue and to taxes. But again, I think that's so important. This is some efforts we made to really call for this comprehensive housing bill. And this scene that you're seeing here on the screen, this was a panel that I had organized to follow Governor Baker. And so Governor Baker stood up at this housing committee hearing back in May of 2019. And he told the Joint Committee on Housing that the primary driver of the housing emergency in Massachusetts is zoning. He said zoning is the primary reason that we are in this position. And in my role organizing this panel, I stood up and I said, I want to go on record and be very clear and be as clear as I possibly can. So everyone please listen. I agree with the governor that we can work on zoning. I think there are, many barriers to affordability. There's certainly the legacy and the continued impact of redlining and all of the racist history around zoning and the way it's used to exclude. But I also want to be very clear that the governor is wrong when he says that zoning is the primary driver, because there are so many other factors that contribute. And I'm talking about austerity, decades of austerity, a broken economic system, real estate speculation that comes from all over the world targeting our neighborhoods, not to mention the continued impact of racism and white supremacy and how it plays out both in our housing policies and in the day-to-day practices when people try to rent a home or use a voucher or buy a home. And so, I felt like that was so important, and I bring it up again tonight because I really think that's what we're facing. On Beacon Hill, there are those who will tell us the focus has to be rent control. There are others who tell us the focus has to be zoning reform. I don't agree with either of those. I really think it has to be in all of the above. I certainly think we need rent control. I think we need zoning that allows for housing. And then the piece that often gets left out is the money and is the public investment. Are we actually building housing in the public name where we can retain that equity? And we're going to hear from Daniel Denvir on how they're doing that in Rhode Island in a bit. From there, we went on to introduce the Tenant Protection Act. You can see Michelle Wu speaking in 2019. One of the most hopeful things I think that's ever happened for our movement is seeing Michelle Wu win with a strong mandate for rent control. I had an opportunity to meet with Shayla Dillon last week and hear about how Boston will be submitting a home rule petition in the coming weeks to the city council. Then, of course, the pandemic struck. We introduced a foreclosure moratorium. It was actually recognized as the strongest in the nation. We had a large debate on a housing production bill. I'm not going to play you the speech. I'm trying to wrap up my speaking now so we can get to our guests. But the point of this little soliloquy here is that working this legislative process, I briefly mentioned earlier how I spoke up and said, we can't just do the governor's bill. We have to have a comprehensive bill. And fighting that way, working to bring people to the table to make that argument actually got us a modicum of results. And when we finally did take up the governor's bill, as it says here, we passed a tenant opportunity to purchase, we passed eviction ceiling. But those of you probably know what's coming next. The governor signed the things that he liked and he vetoed the things that were tenant protections. Certainly, I don't want to forget that. And this is something we're reminding the Healy-Driscoll administration that these are things that we've already done and we should be able to do them again. In the past 2 years, I've taken you up past 4 years. So now I'm up to the final 2 years here of my time on Beacon Hill. ARPA, the federal, COVID-19 pandemic response, it's kind of been a double-edged sword for our housing production and our tenant protection goals. And that's because the legislature's been busy just spending money. You see here, we did over $600 million in additional housing investments on top of what we normally do last year. This year, we recently did an economic development bill. It has an additional $400 million. So that adds up to over $1 billion of additional funds in the past year. And the good news is certainly that money helps, but what's been frustrating is I think for some people in leadership, it's made it easy to sort of check the box and say, hey, we just did $1 billion. shouldn't you be happy? And of course, we know that $1 billion will only be a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things. And what we need are policy change and sustainable sources of revenue, not just one-time federal revenue. So this is sort of just a recap of a lot of things I've already mentioned. But I do want to focus real quick on these photos because I think it's helpful for all of us to see this. This is governors in California, in New York, and in Oregon actually passing tenant protections, passing bills to cap rents, passing bills to enable strong local protections. So this isn't far-fetched. This isn't planet Mars. This is in the United States of America. In the past few years, this has happened. I certainly think it can happen in the new legislative term, particularly now that Governor Healy is saying she will support local options for rent stabilization. And one final thing that I'm so excited about is this push for really big chunks of revenue. And we just passed the Fair Share Amendment. It was such a collective accomplishment. But to really get at the level of revenue we need to get to functional zero homelessness, to build social housing, I think we should tax large corporations. The largest corporations got a 14% tax cut from the federal government during the Trump administration. I have legislation, it's modeled on what's happening here in San Francisco and Seattle, that would apply a small excise to the gross receipts of the largest corporations. And that's something that's constitutionally legal because it's an excise. And with that, we could raise hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars to fund those housing first programs, to expand housing vouchers, and to build social housing and to support community land trusts. So there's really a lot of opportunity there. Hardly anyone is talking about that level of taxation, but I think it's something that could be popular. I did a quick timeline of the session. This is just sort of the session starts next week. There'll be a bill filing deadline. There'll be committee hearings. If we do end up doing a ballot question, you know, there are deadlines for that in the fall to get that on the ballot. Susie Shannon is a veteran of passing ballot questions in California, so I'm looking forward to her talking to us about that. Thank you, Susie. And that's about it. So I rifled through my slides. I wanted to give time for conversation. What I'm going to do now with the program is I'm first going to kick it to Nicole and Melissa, who are both doing organizing in the city of Somerville. And Nicole works with CAS, which is one of the key organizations in our district. Melissa is doing some organizing with landlords for affordable housing, which I think is so important. We're then going to hear from Daniel Denvir, who will talk to us from Rhode Island. We're going to hear from Susie Shannon, who's speaking to us from California. And then in the time that remains, I'm going to invite, in particular, the elected officials on the city level who have joined us tonight to really offer whatever feedback, whatever input, whatever inspiration they may have from some of these ideas that we're putting on the table. So yeah, thanks for joining us. And with that, I'm gonna pass it to Nicole to hear a bit about the organizing she's doing in the community and the work we've been doing with my office to really try to build consensus among everyone for this Housing for All vision and agenda. So take it away, Nicole.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Eigbrett. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a tenant in East Somerville and proud constituent of Rep. Mike Connolly, as well as many of the councilors here this evening. It's really great to be here with all of you, new friends, new neighbors, as well as folks that I've been getting to know and organize alongside the last few years. So I think the reason many of you know me is because of the work that I do with CAS, the Community Action Agency of Somerville. Disclaimer that I am here in my personal capacity, but I'm going to talk a lot about the work that CAS does, right? Because let's not pretend here, you know, the personal is political. And I think the reason all of us are here tonight is because we care about our community and our neighbors across the Commonwealth, not just in Mike's district. So I'm also going to share my screen for a couple minutes to just talk about the organizing that we're doing and fighting for housing justice in Somerville. Okay, so I will move through some of these slides pretty quickly so then I can pass it to Melissa. But, you know, as I mentioned, CAS, we're a nonprofit and federally funded human service agency. And for folks who maybe don't know us, you might be wondering, you know, how does an anti-poverty agency do organizing? But in fact, we really view our mission as an anti-poverty agency as working on these structural and systemic issues that are causing poverty. And so it is my privilege to be doing this housing justice organizing alongside my working class and low income neighbors. And we really utilize our assets as a human service agency to build a base of leaders and power from tenants who are the most impacted by housing injustice. So these are the values that guide us. So our work, you know, we're doing tenants' rights and advocacy in Somerville. We are developing leaders to build power for low-income residents, immigrants and residents of color, residents with disabilities, seniors, LGBTQ residents, and so forth. Organizing campaigns that challenge bad actors like speculative developers and landlords who are trying to just ruthlessly push out our neighbors, as well as campaigns to change policy. And ultimately, our goal is to continue uniting our community as a multi-class, multiracial, and multicultural movement for housing justice. So here's a quick preview, snapshot, I should say, of our monthly Somerville renters meetings. So, you know, I have to do reporting, of course, to our funders and, you know, looking at the attendance from the past year, September 2021 to 2022, we had over 300 residents attend our monthly renters meetings where folks can meet their neighbors, learn about their rights and resources, and learn about organizing. These are multicultural and multilingual meetings. And so we did some data collection here, and we estimated that around 72% of the residents coming to our meetings, you know, don't consider English their primary language, which we think is absolutely beautiful. But I think the phrase that I like to do most use most in terms of what the work that we're doing is ultimately moving residents from crisis to courage, right? At CAS, we are often meeting our neighbors in their worst situations when they're about to be evicted and lose the home and community that they've called their own for decades in some cases. And I think the most powerful and humbling aspect of this work is helping residents stabilize and fight back. So I just want to share some photos of some of the highlights of this past year. A big chunk of our work is organizing tenants in at-risk buildings. You know, I see Ellen Schachter's here in the call, and I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to her, as well as the Somerville Office of Housing Stability, which has been a core partner in this work. So here's a rally we held in July, a building of 3 Brazilian families in Winter Hill. We have since been able to negotiate them a year-long lease that's more affordable, as well as you know, providing the tenants more time to move out. We had a rally in September at Tremont Street, like a 3-minute walk from the Union Square GLX station. This is a building of 5 different families from El Salvador and Haiti who are actively in the court eviction process. I know many folks here have been helping us advocate for these tenants to make sure this developer doesn't just, you know, flip and evict everyone living here. You know, our displacement work also happens because of the community of solidarity that we have here in Somerville. We have such an amazing base of volunteers that turn out for our actions. Many of you were part of our community press conference when the Green Line Extension Union Square branch opened in March of last year. And we were at it again 2 weeks ago when the Medford branch opened. And you know, I want to emphasize that CAS and our whole community is emphatically pro-transit, but we also know you can't have transit justice without housing justice. So we were out there in the 25 degrees, making sure that Governor Baker and everyone else is continuing to pay attention to the affordable housing and displacement crisis. We also are getting on the ground around the city. We do, know your rights literature drops, and try to get out on a monthly basis. The photo in the top corner, I think it's from February of last year. And then the map on the left is ultimately all the streets that we were able to canvass this past year with flyers. So definitely proud of our coverage here. And we were able to do just as much, if not more, actually in 2021. And then honestly, I think one of the most important aspects of the work that we're doing as CAS is how we're building tenant leadership. So last spring, we were really proud to have graduated our first cohort of residents from the Leadership Development Institute, otherwise known as the LDI. Folks in the room might be familiar with that program when it used to be run by Somerville Community Corporation. And CAS is really proud to be carrying on that legacy and really remolding it to fit the vision of our organizing today. Those same tenant leaders are the folks now leading our work. So here's a photo of one of my neighbors and actually another East Somerville constituent, Jolanda. She and other tenants are doing Know Your Rights outreach in their churches, the public schools, community events, and on social media, and really trying to reach people where they're at. And then our Somerville Renters Committee, which is the group of tenants who completed the LDI and are now leading a lot of the vision and strategy of our work at CAS. They're the ones in the room now, meeting with Mayor Ballantyne, Ellen, and other, elected officials to share their stories and be advocating ardently for the resources that we need for systemic change. And so then when we think about what's next, a lot of the work has to continue. We're going to remain Somerville's on the ground response to the displacement crisis, really dig into our base building and leadership development. We're hoping to offer the LDI again this spring and keep widening that circle. I'm very excited to be expanding our community partner and coalition building with groups like the Somerville Community Land Trust this year. Shout out to everyone in this room again who's been making this longer term vision for community owned housing and land possible. And we'll continue our policy advocacy at the municipal level, but it's the state legislative advocacy that we really see as the linchpin that makes this all possible. Because while we've had numerous successes, this past year we were able to extend Somerville's eviction moratorium to make it the longest continuous moratorium in Massachusetts. We organized tenant unions and campaigns across 8 different properties in the city. And we mobilized hundreds of people across our renters meetings, Know Your Rights trainings, canvasses, and advocacy hours and rallies. However, ultimately, we know a lot of this is just mitigation measures. And we're celebrating the victories where we have them, but a lot of this is just short-term success. So we absolutely need these structural barriers at the state level removed. And so stop sharing for a sec. With that recap, my ask and my excitement and invitation to all of you, especially folks who are part of organized groups across the state and see yourselves getting involved in more state legislative advocacy this year, is to get involved in the legislative table that Mike's office in partnership with CAS plan on starting next month. So this is very much in its nascent stages and we're still building it as we fly it. But this legislative table for Housing for All is really meant to be a venue for consensus building towards these policy solutions that Mike kind of opened this convening with. And yeah, our intention is to engage with grassroots groups and electeds statewide. For instance, it's really great to see Etel from Worcester, joining us this evening. And, we would ask that if you are a member of a grassroots group or any sort of organized body that would like to be part of this and help bridge these connections, I think Mike's going to put the link to the legislative table interest form in the chat. So tried to keep that brief, but I think that's it from me. And thank you all so much. I'm really happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks for all of the work you're doing. Nicole used to be a staffer at the State House, and for the past 2 years has been leading these efforts in Somerville, and it's really been extraordinary. I wish there wasn't so much need for this work in the district I represent, but there is, and you've been doing so much great work on this front. Real quickly, I want to bring in Melissa McWhinney. She told me about this project she's doing to try to organize landlords for affordable housing, and I believe rent stabilization. And personally, I feel that's so important. I think we're going to win rent control and we're going to win housing for all when we convince homeowners and landlords that we're on their side too, and we have an agenda that really speaks to everyone. Obviously, if you are a bad corporate landlord, I'm not sure we have an agenda for you. But there's no reason why these debates have to be tenants versus landlords on Beacon Hill. I would much rather it be tenants, homeowners, and many landlords versus corporations and a few other less willing participants. So with that, I'd love, Melissa, if you can just introduce the concept that you're working on, and I know you're just getting this started as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you, Nicole. My goodness, I have to say it does my heart good to have you guys in this mix and fighting the good fight. So thank you so much for what you do. I'm Melissa McWhinney. I'm a Somerville resident. I am about to leave a job and start working half-time for a group I'm going to tell you about in a minute. I'm also going to say today I'm speaking entirely as a private citizen and in a personal capacity. So there is a privately funded organization that doesn't exist yet called Landlords for Affordable Housing, and it's going to be my fun job to try to turn this into a reality. My husband and I are actually landlords ourselves. We own a 2-family in Somerville. I was very shocked to find out that the rent that we charge, which is quite low for the other unit, is $1,000 a month less than federal fair market rent, according to HUD. Shocking. Wow, rents are shockingly high. So, but everybody knows that. So this is, and thanks, Mike, for the opportunity to talk about it for a minute. It's privately funded. It's a vision in someone's eye, and what he and the steering committee of housing providers would like to see is that it will organize landlord voices to speak out on issues of housing equity, that housing is a human right, to rise up and say, yes, we think that some sort of rent control is reasonable. Yes, there should be rent stabilization. Yes, we don't want to see so many people evicted in our community. Also to work on policy issues, a lot of which have been talked about already and some of which will be talked about soon. And also to serve landlords, small landlords, with connection to resources and support so that they will be able to continue to be affordable housing landlords or can start doing so. One of the things we're going to do first is to send out a survey. I'd actually am going to sit down and talk to a lot of people to sort of probe what the concerns are, barriers to being a landlord who can provide affordable housing. And so I'm going to put my email address in the chat. It's melissamcwhinney@gmail.com. I'll put it in there in a minute. And if you're at all interested in following this effort or being connected, and I will say it's not just Somerville, Mike, it's going to be Greater Boston. So, but Somerville's always a good place to start, as we can see. So I'm just going to put my email address in the chat if you are interested in being connected or being put on a mailing list. If you are a landlord and are willing to identify yourself as such, that would be great. It's fine if you're not. It's something that needs to happen. And Mike, I'm going to tease you for 1 second and say, I didn't see landlords anywhere on your vision list. So you're going to have to put them on there. And thank you. And I'm going to pass it back to Mike.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm so glad you're getting this initiative started. I know State Senator Lydia Edwards, who's also a landlord, is making an effort to organize landlords in Boston as well. Speaking of Senator Edwards, yet another initiative that we are working to get off the ground now is a Housing for All legislative caucus. We rolled this out a few weeks ago. We sent an email out before the holidays to the legislature. So far, we have 30 people who have signed up, 30 reps and senators. Also, Rep. Diggs of the Cape is involved with myself and Senator Edwards. And it's really just another venue to really try to have this conversation. So thanks, Melissa. Excited for the table, for the landlords, for the caucus, and everything we're all doing in our own coalitions. So with that, I want to bring in someone who I've been a massive fan of. I'll admit it's been through Twitter, through Jacobin, through podcasts. Big fan of his work, Daniel Denvir, and particularly would love for you to really tell us all you can about the push for social housing and any thoughts you might have on what we're talking about this evening, which is really trying to coalesce around a vision for a universal housing program, something that could bring housing up to the stature that education and healthcare already get in our government spending and our regulations. So thank you, Daniel.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Rep. Connolly. My name is Dan Denvir. My day job is hosting a podcast called The Dig. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about my work as co-chair of a group called Reclaim Rhode Island that came out of, thank you, Jim. And it's really good to see Ben Campen as well, who is an old friend. Here to talk about my work with Reclaim Rhode Island, a group that I'm a co-chair of that came out of the Burnley campaign in 2020. And we have been all volunteer and will remain so until the new year when our first staff person will come on board. And we've worked on a lot of different things over our 2.5 years in existence, but a little over a year ago, we pivoted almost 100% to housing and our Homes for All campaign, which has two main prongs. One is the Create Homes Act, which was introduced in the Rhode Island Senate by Senator Megan Coleman this past session this spring. And the other is a newer tenant organizing project that we started about maybe 4 or 5 months ago that's targeting one of the biggest and nastiest slumlords in Rhode Island, a company called Pioneer Investments. And the reason, the way these two things work together is that in the past, we've done, when we were doing legislative work, we would try to do grassroots mobilizing around it and grassroots agitation around it and go knock on doors in particular legislative districts and have conversations at the door and gather postcards. And we basically decided that, to the extent that we were successful legislatively, which we have been, including with the state's cannabis legalization law, which as an aside sets aside 6 of the 32 odd licenses for worker-owned cooperatives in a first in the country. That was our first big legislative win. Anyhow, we decided that we won that because of our strong electoral work and our good inside game and our good policy game. And actually the grassroots organizing around it was not effective, frankly. And so we were like, okay, but we want to be a grassroots centered organization. What are we going to do with our grassroots work that's taking up the majority of our volunteer leadership, attention, and time? And so we decided that the best way to support the Create Homes Act was to do this tenant organizing work that's not directly related to the Create Homes Act, because there's not really an organized tenant movement in Rhode Island, and that we believe to win the housing system, the public and socially centered housing system that we deserve, that we need an organized tenant movement. So even though they're not directly related, we see them as fundamentally intertwined. So the campaign against Pioneer, I'll briefly mention before I get to the Create Homes Act. It's been exciting. We've been organizing in particular in the cities of West Warwick, Woonsocket, Pawtucket, and Central Falls, where a lot of this guy's properties are located. It's really showed us the need of the Create Homes Act, because the poorest people in the state have nowhere to go and are at the whim of slumlords who force people to live in atrocious conditions with rats and black mold and constant leaks and broken everything and no heat, have people having to use stoves. for heat, all paying, frankly, higher rents than I've ever paid in my life. It's one of these like really, it's expensive to be poor situations, and there's no exit option because it's an extremely tight housing market, and it's particularly tight for poor people. So the Create Homes Act has a lot of different facets, but the core piece of it that Reclaim is interested in is a provision that would create what's called a public developer of housing at the state level. This model only exists in one place so far in the United States, which is at the county level in Montgomery County, Maryland, and suburban Washington, DC. And what it basically does is create a housing production fund that's a revolving fund. And the public sector just builds mixed income housing, and the units of more affluent people cross-subsidize the affordable rents of poorer people who are paying less rent. So it's like a range of different AMIs, area median incomes, and that provides a basic level of affordability. But then the question comes in of how wide the affordability can be, i.e. what percentage of the units are affordable and how deep the affordability can be. And then that brings us to issues that Rep. Connolly was discussing earlier, which is we need more tax revenue. And so we anticipate that we're in very good shape to win the basic public developer this session. Speaker Joseph Shikarchi is very open to it, has spoken favorably about it publicly. In the last session, Senator Megan Coleman has had the support of rather centrist to conservative Senate Democratic leadership. So we feel like we're in pretty good shape to win this session, but it will not be enough to solve the housing crisis. That it'll be a big start, and I hope a model that the whole country can take inspiration from. But we're also going to be introducing legislation to raise more revenue to actually fund this public developer and capitalize it with as much subsidy as possible. Those are going to be, frankly, harder wins this session, but we are going to have these bills introduced. And right now, we don't know for sure, but it looks like those might be bills around raising revenue from second home taxes, Airbnb taxes, real estate speculation taxes. Those are some of the ideas that we're floating around ultimately, and those are all housing related, obviously. So they're the ideas, there's kind of a connection there, but obviously we need kind of broader based tax increases too, particularly a income tax and wealth increases, income tax increases and wealth taxes on the wealthiest people in Rhode Island. That's been a multi-year struggle that I don't think is going to be winnable this year, but ultimately to get enough funding, it's going to be necessary. So if, knock on wood, we are successful in passing Create Homes and a public developer with a housing production revolving fund this session, then that sets us up. I mean, that'll start building housing that people need for both low and moderate income, ASAP, but not enough. And that'll set us up to next session, come back with numbers being like, this is the housing shortfall for people at each of these income brackets. And this is precisely how much money, I mean, not precisely, but this is how much money would have to be put in the public developer to literally end the housing crisis in this state. That I think is the powerful thing that merely establishing a public developer, even if it has insufficient funding to do everything you want it to do, allows for. It allows for you to organize, it gives the state the capacity to directly build housing, either through the State Department of Housing or through PHAs or through CDCs. The CDCs have been politically complicated on this question. I'm happy to get into that or talk to anyone offline about the politics around that. And because the state has that capacity, because the public sector has that capacity, people can make a direct demand on the state to solve the housing crisis in a way that's not possible right now. Right now, you'll hear people say, oh, we dedicated $50 million to affordable housing, $100 million to affordable housing, and no one ever knows what that means or exactly what that buys in terms of actual production. We're also very interested in tenant protection bills, and we'll be supporting a number of those as well. The last thing I'll say about Create Homes is that another really interesting provision of it is that it creates a state land bank. that allows the state to forcibly transfer publicly held land that's not being used into it for housing production. And then a second cool thing is by pushing PHAs to develop housing again, something they haven't done mostly in a very long time. PHAs are not bound by local zoning restrictions, so that's exciting. And lastly, there is a provision in the Create Homes Act that has aroused a lot of opposition from wealthy suburbs, which would allow the State Department of Housing in Rhode Island. Every municipality is supposed to have 10% of their housing affordable. And I believe there's only about 6 municipalities. So they're the ones you could guess, the ones with a lot of poor people like Providence or Pawtucket or Woonsocket that meet that mark. This would provide some carrots in terms of education funding for municipalities to meet the 10% remark. And then I think it's after 5 years, if they don't, the State Department of Housing can come in directly, override any exclusionary zoning necessary, and just directly build housing in those recalcitrant affluent municipalities. And then lastly, the legislation was introduced this May near the end of session, and we really had no chance at passing it, but in a very goodwill gesture from the Rhode Island House leadership, we did get a $10 million public housing pilot project passed, and that's going to be the first directly state-funded public housing construction in memory in Rhode Island. Pretty unusual anywhere, given that new public housing construction is traditionally funded by federal Section 9 funds, but hasn't been funded at all in quite a long time. So yeah, that's where we're at, and it's exciting. And I'm excited to see people in Somerville and throughout Massachusetts and really all over the country really turning to these really innovative and progressive housing ideas, because it's the time's really right. And there's so much that right-wing sociopaths at the national level make entirely impossible, but really in any blue state, these kind of progressive housing demands are demandable and should be winnable, I believe.
Wow, thank you so much for that overview, Daniel. Yeah, let's hear it for Daniel. And I loved the part, because I've been saying this a lot myself, I loved the part where you talked about when we set up this public developer, it'll actually be possible to map out how much investment we need to resolve the crisis, right? And I feel like so much of our advocacy is different people are in different lanes thinking, how do we incrementally move forward? And of course, that's important. But I think what you're getting at, and what I hope we're getting at, is there's also going to be a space and some time to start at the end and say all people have housing, and sort of work back and say, what did it take for us to get there? If that makes sense. And it sounds like social housing gives us that opportunity. Should we take a question or two, or should we just move to Susie's? Any burning questions for Daniel? Let's, I see we're running late, so we'll take, I saw Willie Burnley and Lee Ferris. So let's hear from Councilor Burnley. Let's hear from Lee. Quick questions, quick answers, because I'm already late on my promise to end this at 6, but let's have some dialogue. Willie, how you doing, my friend? Thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Sorry for asking the question. I don't want to hold us up.
No, do it.
To Dan, can you just speak more to the point about what tenant protections y'all are working on in this upcoming year?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know for sure, and we're not putting, because our policy operations all volunteer, like everything else except for our first ever tenant organizer coming on the first. And I'm going to make a pitch. If anyone knows funders who are interested in this work, we don't know what we're doing on the funding front and are just starting to figure it out. We are a very legitimately scrappy entity, but we're accomplishing a lot. Anyhow, pitch made. But stuff that we're interested in is one particular thing we're interested in is a legislation that would bar eviction either in the case of lead, violations, or hopefully something a little broader, like serious code violations that would include lead, rats, other things. I'm not sure exactly what fall in the category. We might just get lead introduced. We might get something a little broader, but that's one that's top of mind that we're interested in seeing introduced. But we're not directly. We'll be supporting it, but we're not directly involved in introducing it.
Go ahead,
Hi,
Lee.
I'm Lee Ferris from Cambridge. Quick question, why do you say this is social housing after that's distinct from, I don't know, I've heard other definitions of social housing that are a little different than what you said. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention, and one thing we need to kind of be more explicit and articulate about is under this legislation, not only could CDCs produce housing, but so as in the original visions for social housing that were gaining a lot of traction but failed to win in the 1930s, so could labor unions, so could limited equity cooperatives, like a lot of different stuff that's non-commercial and state-backed, but not necessarily of the state. So I think social housing refers to this broader panoply of state-backed non-commercial housing that includes things that look a lot more like traditional public housing and things that are not owned by the state, but are financed and funded by the state, at least to get off the ground. That's one thing. And then I think generally it's to emphasize that, the defeat of social housing proposals that groups like the Labor Housing Conference were putting forward in the 1930s. When they lost out to was a real estate industry that did everything it could to kill public housing, period, but short of that, to ensure that it was exclusively for the very poorest people in society. And what social housing looks like in places that people tend to look like, obviously like Vienna, is that it's housing that aims to house and appeal to the majority of people. And so that's a key distinction. We want middle-class people in publicly owned housing as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And I hope this is just the start of us being in touch and us working in partnership. I put the remaining speakers in the chat, although Councilor Azeem has to leave us at 6, so he's going to say a quick word of hello. And then we're going to pass it to Susie Shannon to hear about all of the ballot campaigns that are happening in California. But good evening, Councilor Azeem.
Thank you, Representative Connolly. Just so happy to be here. I won't take too much of your time, and apologies, I have to leave at 6. I just wanted to say, Representative Connolly has been doing all of the things, and he's totally right in that we need to be having a yes and approach to housing, really taking a look at everything. I thought that the speaker Daniel before about public housing is totally on the mark. I haven't been able to figure out things. I don't know how Cambridge could fit in or anything, but I've been having a lot of conversations with Polly Williams specifically about the Maryland program that they've been doing. And I think that is, from everything I've heard, an absolutely fantastic program. So I could not support it more. Oh, exciting. So we're all talking to the same people. And so that's something I'm really, really excited about. And just wanted to also thank Representative Connolly. I know rent stabilization is something that's a hard push to get over, but he's been doing a lot of work over it. And I would be so excited if we get a local option. And so really hoping that we can get that one over the top in particular. I just wanted to echo and support. Thank you guys. Sorry, I have to leave in a minute. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us, Burhan, Councilor, and now my neighbor here in Cambridge. It's great to see you. And really, thank you all for joining us. We should give ourselves a pat on the back. It's the holiday season. I'm definitely taking the weekend off, so don't worry about me. But I was like, yeah, I can squeeze a couple more days of work in this week. And so that's what I tried to do. And thank you all for being here and making it a true end of year event. So with that, excited to hear from Susie and really hear, your perspective on this conversation and maybe some of the highlights of what has been happening in California. So thank you, Susie, for all that you do with housing as a human right.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank Representative Mike Connolly for all of his leadership on housing, affordable housing, rent control. He's really leading. And I have to say, as somebody who's always looking to find our champions here in California, I always know you're going to be the champion in Massachusetts. So I want to thank you for bringing us all together today. I'm Susie Shannon. I am the policy director for Housing as a Human Right. We are a national organization. We're based in California and Los Angeles, and we're part of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And we have a national coalition on affordable housing, rent control, and solutions to homelessness. But I want to talk about what we're actually doing in California and talk about the solutions, the actual solutions, not the problems. So one of the things that we're doing, so I should also mention that I'm the drafter of the Housing First legislation, SB 1380, which passed here in 2016. And so one of the things that has been an ongoing problem here in California is the increase in homelessness. We have over 161,000 people who are homeless in the state of California. 69,000 of those are in the county of Los Angeles. So when I say that, I'm letting you know too that we're a cautionary tale and what not to do. So a lot of times I hear across the country, a lot of things that people are going to try. And sometimes we have tried them already and massively failed and increased homelessness in the process. So one of those things that we have tried is to overbuild on our market rate housing and have that trickle down to the rest of our population, including our homeless population. I can tell you, as somebody who is both formerly unhoused and who has worked with our unhoused population since 2005, that does not work. In fact, the city of Los Angeles overbuilt 71,000 units of market rate housing in the city of LA, while they underbuilt 34,000 units of extremely low, very low, low income and moderate income housing. Okay, so we can look at what the needs are, but we also have to look at where we're putting the priority. So I want to talk about what the solutions are that we have started to put in place here that are actually working. One of the things that we have in Los Angeles is a large number of empty buildings. We have 70,000 empty units, vacant units here in the city of LA. And we have 49,000 in the city of LA who are unhoused. We literally have homeless encampments in the shadows of empty buildings here. So one of the things we have begun to institute, and when I say we, I mean my organization, which has now housed over 1,400 people in vacant buildings that have been rehabbed. And I'll let you understand why it's so important. When we passed a bond measure in 2016, and we put $2.2 billion into housing, that was supposed to build 10,000 units of housing, of affordable housing, maybe housing for people who are unhoused here in LA. But the cost to build each unit, and brace yourselves because I know a lot of you are in Massachusetts, was $500,000 to $700,000 for a 400 square unit of housing. Can you imagine that? We could have bought condos for every single person that was, to get a unit. We could have bought them a condo, given them a couple $100,000 in spending cash, and they would have been homeowners for what we were spending for a single unit. Contrast that with adaptive reuse, where we've taken these empty buildings and converted them. It's cost us on average, $100,000 a door. So we have housed, our organization, our little organization here has housed more people in 3 years here in Los Angeles than the city of LA has housed since 2016 with the bond measure money. So we are very much, advocating for and pushing as much as possible adaptive reuse. And this is also at the commercial level. So there's been adaptive reuse of,
courthouses, libraries that are empty. We have a lot of businesses that are empty now, where we can take the existing infrastructure and convert that into housing. Hospitals too, we've just converted a hospital. Some of my clients who I work with who are unhoused are there now and are really kind of loving it. And that was built with prefab modular housing. So that is our second, the second thing that we're looking at is if we build from the ground up, we want to do that in a way that we can build the quickest way possible, get the most value for it. And that means the least cost per unit, right? That sounds pretty obvious. So we have found that building with prefab modular housing, which I have been pushing since 2014 when they started doing this in the UK with their Y cubes. I've been pushing this in 2014 and we have just started, and we can build at approximately $200,000 to $300,000 a unit here in LA, as opposed to the $500,000 to $700,000 a unit that we're building here. I mean, there have even been, some units built in San Francisco where it's been almost $900,000 to $1 million a unit. And these are tiny units. And we're not talking about like 10 bedroom apartments or something like this. These are small 400 square foot units. So adaptive reuse, we put in a bill last year, AB 1695, which actually allows for government funding for organizations that want to convert empty buildings, empty units, that kind of thing. For the prefab modular housing, we're still working on this. This has become a union issue because the building trades don't want it, but the carpenters do, because they actually own a company here that does prefab modular housing that's unionized. And so we're just trying to get through all of this. The county has managed to get around that. But we are definitely trying to get, if there's building from the ground up and a need, because we believe that with adaptive reuse and prefab modular housing, building both of those ways, we can help address this homelessness crisis. And we will be building using prefab modular housing over 500 units in the next couple of years. We should be breaking ground on our first building in the next few months, given the permitting and that kind of thing. So that's on that end. The other part that we're working on is the prevention, and that's where rent control comes in. So we have put 2 initiatives on the ballot so far in California to undo something called Costa-Hawkins. And as you know, corporate developers went across the United States in the 1990s, and they got rid of rent control in a lot of different states, including Massachusetts. And so we also had that here in California, although they grandfathered in a few cities where you could still have rent control, but it's not for any building in LA that was built in 1978 or before, no building in San Francisco, unless it was built in 1979 or before, and no place in the state of California that was built after 1995. So what we've seen in California here has been amazing, because a lot of the smaller cities, Pasadena, Pomona, Santa Ana, Santa Monica, and then we've even seen it in other states like in Minnesota with St. Paul and Minneapolis, have adopted rent control. And here, it's only rent control for buildings that are built in 1995 or before. But the fact that they have been able to put through these initiatives or get the city councils to vote for these, to vote to enact rent control in these smaller cities, actually bodes very well for a statewide proposition here in California. So we put Prop 10 on the ballot, put Prop 21 on the ballot. I worked on both of those. For Prop 21, we spent about $30 million to get it passed. Corporate developers and our California Apartment Owners Association spent over $100 million on a campaign to scare renters, say that rent control was bad for renters, rent control is bad for mom and pop landlords, rent control is bad for immigrants, on and on and on. They outspent us 3 to 1. But we have been seeing that in places where the California Apartment Association has supported candidates and put a lot of money into their campaigns, they have lost. And where they have gone against these ballot initiatives or city council initiatives, city council legislation, they are losing. And so about a couple of weeks ago, we put in for a new statewide initiative, the Justice for Renters Act. And that is actually going to allow our municipalities to enact, expand, or maintain rent control in their localities. So that would be great. So that means that we're not limited to buildings that are 1995 or earlier. We can enact all kinds of things around rent control and really help people who are suffering. There was a Zillow report, many of you probably saw it, that for every 5% increase in rent, 2,000 more people become unhoused. We have seen this all over California. I'm in the heart of it here in LA. And so we don't have time to complain. We just have to come up with solutions and implement them as quickly as possible. And so these are the ways that we found is most helpful. And then in our national coalition, what we've been able to do is sort of to share stories. I have to say the folks who, were in St. Paul and Minneapolis were very helpful to the folks running the campaign here in Pasadena, which just passed in November, rent control, in terms of like letting us know where the icebergs are, letting us know what the messaging on the other side is going to be. How can we counteract that? What is the best way, to reach out to homeowners? What is the best way to make sure that renters are not told lies, basically lies from corporate developers in these campaigns? And how do you gain their trust to trust you as opposed to them and their rhetoric? So, for a national coalition, what we're trying to do is to reverse a lot of what happened in the 1990s and to, get state legislation passed or statewide propositions to basically, enact or expand rent control. We feel that, it was really in 1990s when that happened that we saw a huge rise in homelessness. We know that as rents go up, tents go up. And like I said, Los Angeles is like your cautionary tale. Very hard to build your way out of it. Existing infrastructure, definitely use it. Build prefab modular housing when and if you can, and make sure that tenants are protected, but also that we have rent control, because we can have all the protections in the world. The one protection that we don't have, though, is if we can't pay the rent, eventually we're going to get evicted, right? I am a lifelong tenant, or I've been a lifelong tenant up until now. I'm sure I will continue to be, because the cost of housing here is insane. But so is the cost of rent. So, literally you have to make at least $100,000 now to afford a 2-bedroom apartment here in Los Angeles. So you either have to double or triple up with roommates. I'm a single mom and somebody who is formerly unhoused. So I just work very hard, as do other people. But I know that a lot of people can't zoom into their jobs. A lot of our frontline workers don't make enough money and they are pushed out of our city. They're driving hours to get to work there and back. They can't spend time with their children because they're busy traveling. And it's just become unconscionable here in LA. And I see it happening all over the country. So I'm hoping that people will prioritize building for folks who are unhoused and very low income, that they will support low income tenants. I understand mixed income very, very well. I also understand that I've been working with our unhoused population since 2016, and it's very hard for me to get somebody who is homeless even into affordable housing, because landlords create applications that require 36 months of permanent rental history, which means that in order to get into the affordable housing, you can't be homeless. Not only can you not be homeless at the time that you're applying, but you can't have been homeless for the 3 years beforehand. and it has to be verified by your former landlords. So they actually send like verification forms to former landlords to prove that you actually have been housed for 3 years. So I understand mixed income, but we need to protect people who are unhoused, people who are at 30% of the area median income and below. We need to protect obviously middle-class housing as well, which is why I'm a strong supporter of rent control. But I can tell you, as somebody who like just yesterday was getting 2 refugees from Peru into any place, you know, a hotel, that in order for them to be housed, we're going to have to create housing for them. And that's not necessarily going to be mixed income. So that's my presentation. And thank you again, Representative Connolly.
Oh, wow. Yeah, let's hear it for Susie, everyone. Thank you for all that inspiring work. So real quickly, I just want to ask one follow-up question. Could you give us just a real brief rundown? What were the ballot wins and were there any ballot losses in the recent year? Or if there are just some highlights, I think, was it Santa Cruz or Santa Monica? One of the Santas, you said there was an important ballot campaign.
Yeah, sure. So Pasadena won. That was in November. That was huge. I mean, we knew that Pasadena, we put a lot of money, our organization put a lot of money into that particular
and that was rent control.
Ballot measure, because without money, they couldn't get the word out. So we were very excited. And so that creates 3%, a cap, 3% cap in terms of an increase in rent, creates a rent board, just cause eviction, like sweeping legislation. And then we won in Pomona, and that was through a vote of, and we put some money into that too, but that was a vote of the city council there. And they just won by 1 vote to have a cap of a 4% increase. Santa Ana won 3%. That was about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. Santa Monica just won 3%. And that was through the city council. So yeah, so everywhere that we have tried to get it, with the exception of there was one very small city where it didn't pass. But every single place that we have tried to get rent control enacted at the local level, and that's again for buildings that are built in 1995 or before, so you can't do it afterward because of Costa-Hawkins. We have won, and it's been a grassroots effort. In Pasadena, they had both a campaign for renters and for homeowners, and there were actually a lot of homeowners that were supporting rent control. And part of that really was that people, you know, homeowners have children and they want their children to be able to live in the city where they grew up in. They want to see their grandkids, and you know, a lot of them are realizing that they're not going to be able to do that if the rent is too high, you know, and they see
Right.
that neighbors are leaving. Our school districts are having trouble maintaining any like population within these schools, and a lot of them are closing because families can't afford to live here anymore. So I think that people are starting to make those connections between what's happening in their neighborhoods, increasing homelessness and rents.
Wow, yeah, that's so inspiring. Thank you so much, Susie. And I know we could talk for hours about all of these topics. We have 5 city councilors from Worcester to Somerville. I figure if they each speak 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes tops, we'll be out of here at 6:30. So this is like the World Cup. I'm calling 10 minutes of extra time and then the game is going to be over. And also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, ostensibly, this is a fundraiser for my political committee. I did not organize any fundraisers this session. It was all about the work, responding to the Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court, responding to the MBTA, which caught fire way too many times, certainly passing the economic development bill and delivering over $1 million to nonprofits and planning projects here in our community. So it was a super busy year, and thank you, Ellen. I was just about to do that. There is the Act Blue link if you haven't already contributed. And I should say, many of you on this call have already made contributions. Many of you have made extraordinarily generous contributions. So thank you for that work, or thank you for that support. You know, I really wanted to talk about housing, but felt like I ought to do one fundraiser this year. And so the result was this evening, where we've had a cool chance to hear from some great people, and to really meet Susie and to meet Daniel, both of which I think bring some great perspective. And it's amazing, Susie, to hear that the struggles you're facing are the same struggles we're facing: school teachers, firefighters, baristas, the working class cannot afford to live in our communities. And that goes from Cape Cod to the Berkshires and everywhere in between in Massachusetts. And it's just super inspiring, Susie, to hear about how you're going to the ballot box and winning. And moreover, it was inspiring to hear from Daniel about how Rhode Island, at the highest levels of their political establishment, is taking serious this idea of a public developer and social housing. Both of these pieces, the tenant protections and the building affordable housing, are so important. So thanks again, Susie. Let's hear it for Susie, everyone. And I'd now love to invite into the conversation. We have, I think, 5 city councilors on the line. So if you each could offer maybe just a couple of minutes of any feedback, inspiration, thoughts on this topic, we would love to hear from you. I'd love to start with Etel, who is really the person I look to in the city of Worcester for leadership and for guidance on these housing issues. And Worcester is the 2nd largest city in New England. It's had the fastest rising rents in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I know, Etel, you're on the front lines. Take it away, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Rep. Connolly. I really appreciate you reaching out to Worcester. It feels like sometimes gateway cities kind of are left over from the conversation. And thank you, Susie and Daniel. That resonated really deeply with me. So what keeps me up at night recently is the fact that we're in really frigid temperatures, and we just opened a 60-bed shelter for folks experiencing homelessness. And let me tell you, that was in my district. And that came with a lot of hostility, people harassing, people filming, people saying the most horrible things. Our numbers of folks experiencing homelessness, whether they're sheltered or unsheltered, will increase, or would actually double, we anticipate. And on top of that, we have renters who are completely vulnerable to the market forces, to developers, to policies that really just absolutely are making them really struggle, from especially we're seeing a lot of folks with disabilities and seniors who, in addition to families with kids, are on the verge of losing their homes. So I agree with you, Rep. Connolly, with Susie and Daniel and everybody. We need all hands on deck. We need all sorts of policies, from renter protections to figuring out also how do we bring income equity. A recent report in Worcester shows that rents have gone increasingly dramatically up, while incomes have remained stagnant. So what I worry about is for a lot of the families and renters in Worcester is that no matter how affordable we're making our housing in the rental market, we're still having folks who are living in the margins, and that's just not okay. So I look forward to working in solidarity with a lot of you. I feel like as a recently or not so recently elected municipal leader and housing advocate, we sort of kind of move in the dark without really having a map or a thumbprint for how we protect our folks. And so I look forward to being invited in further conversations with our gateway cities, and just figuring out a blueprint, because I do believe that we need all hands on deck and all sorts of policies to make sure that people like the people in my district and all over Worcester aren't being found dead as a result of homelessness. We had 35 people who lost their lives due to homelessness last year. That's just an incredible amount of people who should be alive today, and they're not. And so thank you all. I don't really have any other words of wisdom other than to say I look forward to working in solidarity and look to you all for inviting us to further conversations. Thanks, Rep. Connolly.
Well, thank you so much, Councilor. Thank you for joining us from Worcester, and your words resonate with me. It's been unfortunate in East Somerville and right on Massachusetts Avenue. We've had numerous unhoused folks pass away and die on the street, and there's just no excuse for it. And I know you are truly on the front line, keeping people housed and keeping people alive in Worcester. So thank you for that. And thanks for your words. I want to just invite my longtime friend and supporter, Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan. He was probably the first person to ever support me in the city of Cambridge. There may have been one or two other people who qualify for that title. But I was just emailing him last night about how 10 years ago, we were talking about net zero, and now the state is moving forward with a fossil fuel-free demonstration program. We're going to be going to a meeting on that next week. Councilor, what do you make of the conversation, and what do you feel like adding to our dialogue tonight?
Thanks so much, Mike, and always happy to support you. Thanks for your great work. In terms of housing in Cambridge, I was glad to hear from our colleagues in California that they're validating our theory, which is that market rate doesn't solve this problem. We have to build more affordable housing. And in Cambridge in particular, we have opportunities to do that by updating our affordable housing overlay so that we allow for denser developments for affordable housing. We also have a huge homelessness problem, particularly in Central Square, but really throughout our city. And it's going to get worse because we just heard that about a month ago that the Salvation Army is going to close their shelter in Central Square. And I'm working with the city manager directly to create a new 28-bed non-congregate low-threshold shelter in North Cambridge. And we require state and city funding to move that forward. So that's something that you might be able to help us with. And then last but not least, we need to get rent control back. And I'm hoping that we can get a home rule petition done next year. So those are just a couple of quick hits, and super excited about the net zero stuff. We're making a lot of progress on that. So thank you for that work. We wouldn't be able to join this fossil-free pilot if it wasn't for you. So again, thanks for helping me file that home rule late last year. So that's all I've got for now. And again, thanks for your work, and always happy to support you.
Well, thank you so much, Quinton, and yeah, thanks for your leadership, especially on insisting that unhoused community members really get that that non-congregate shelter, especially during the pandemic. I know you stood up and insisted on that, and I think it saved lives in that critical moment. So we're coming near the end here. Thank you all for sticking with us. I tried my best to keep it to 1 hour, but it just didn't happen. But one final point I wanted to make to Quinton's point, and it goes to this big vision of what do we mean by housing for all. And it's not one or two policies, it's really offering a better housing future and a better housing situation to really the 99% of us. And we've heard a lot about homeowners tonight. I did the research. 2 out of 3 Massachusetts residents live in an owner-occupied housing unit. And that's not even a building, that's the actual unit, is the owner or presumably their family members. And again, I think that's such a significant figure because I believe we have to say to those folks, our agenda offers you benefits. And I think when it comes to sustainability, there's a huge need there. We are going to have to retrofit everything. We're going to need so many conversions. We're going to need renewable energy sources to really be ramped up. And we need an agenda that's broad enough that says to the homeowner, we can support you with reasonable property tax relief and with sustainability upgrades at the same time that we maintain housing stability and reasonable costs for renters, and at the same time that we achieve functional zero in homelessness, that we have an agenda that will offer something to virtually everyone. And I only thought of it after Quinton spoke, because we know on that sustainability front, we will need hundreds of millions and probably billions of dollars of investment to help people maintain their homes as we get to net zero. So next, I think I will bring in, we've already heard from Willie, so I'm going to designate Willie the closer, and I'm going to bring in Jake Wilson, who we haven't heard from yet tonight. Jake's in his first term on the city council, so I tried to go by seniority with the city councilors. And so Jake, thank you for all your work with Somerville Youth Soccer and on the council this year. It's been great partnering with you on issues, and I'd love for you to share whatever thoughts or inspirations you might have on this topic during your first year in office there.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you putting on this event and bringing together this group of folks working on one of just the absolute most vital issues we're facing here as a society. I know folks want to get on with their evenings, so I just briefly want to tease something I'm personally really excited about that I've been working on here in Somerville with our city council's legislative and policy analyst. It's basically a two-pronged sort of behavioral economics approach tying into our forthcoming rental registry here in Somerville. Basically, in a nutshell, we're looking to create what would basically be a new rental permit with a fee structure that's determined by the rental rate to disincentivize high rents, and then combine that on the carrot side with a new variable property tax credit to reward landlords for offering below market rents. Yes, rent stabilization will be a simpler approach when it does return. And I say will, not if. It's going to happen. I really believe that. And there are a huge number of potential pitfalls and challenges that we have to take into account as we try to carve this out. But just in keeping with the theme of the night, I really believe this is an and situation and not an either or. And I think if we're able to figure out how to do this well, it would really help incentivize good landlord behaviors beyond housing stability and genuinely make a real difference locally in our housing affordability crisis. So if you're here in Somerville, stay tuned for more news on this. Hopefully in the coming months. We have just begun the process of reaching out to key city staff, some of whom are on this call, and we're excited to see where this goes. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jake. Appreciate your service. And I think we all appreciate the brevity as we are now approaching the 6:30 hour. So last but not least, want to introduce another first term Somerville City Councilor, Willie Burnley Jr. Got to know Willie when he was working for our senators and have been so inspired and encouraged by your service so far. So what's your take on all of this convo, and what's your thoughts for us this evening, Councilor?
I'll try to be really brief, less than 2 minutes, just to respect everybody's time. Thank you again, Mike, for inviting me here and for hosting what I think has been a great call. I just want to point out the council has been pushing forward in Somerville on a number of these issues. It is very tricky from a legal perspective, but we've been doing what we can. Earlier this year, I helped pass an amendment to one of our housing bills that now requires that every new tenant gets a 6-page document that I worked with Director Ellen Schachter on, full of their tenant rights, resources, places to reach out for help. And I'm super excited to continue to see that reap the benefits for so many renters in our city. there are so many things that we need to work on, but I'll just say in response to what I heard tonight, we, just like my colleague said, we will have rent stabilization back. We will pass these laws one way or the other. I just want to really emphasize two elements here. The person-to-person communication and community feedback that's going to be required to really build the pressure here. And then also just the concept of unity. I know these conversations are really complex and there's a lot of different sides and different aspects to how we can create housing for all. But at the end of the day, we need to know that unless you are a major corporate landlord in the state of Massachusetts, we are more than likely on the same side here. And we are trying to make sure that people are housed and safe and secure. And so let's approach this conversation from a yes and perspective, from a we can do this, even if it's going to be hard. Let's take on the hard and make sure that everybody's safe at the end of the day, because that's what I'm going to do. And I hope to talk more with y'all in the future about ways that we can really build that momentum in the next year.
Well, thank you so much, Councilor, and thank you for matching Jake in your brevity. It's definitely appreciated, and I, you know, I put 100% in the chat because I completely agree. You know, the way I've been saying it is, you know, we have to, again, convince the homeowner and the landlord that that we have an agenda that will offer them fairness, you know, recognizing unhoused people and tenants are certainly the most marginalized in our society, all things being equal. But I think we will win when we stand for fairness for all concerned. And the final thing I'll say is we saw, you know, I think an example of some great strategy when it came to the Workplace and Family Mobility Act. And for 20 years, you know, we had wanted to make driver's licenses available to all, regardless of immigration status. That didn't move forward. And then this session, you know, the strategy became, let's emphasize road safety. Not that we were sacrificing anything on our immigrant justice front, but we had immigrant justice advocates in our camp, and we just needed to get over the hump and get some people who were in the undecided middle. And when we targeted our messaging around road safety, we did that. We passed the law. We defended it at the ballot box. And I think there's similar opportunities in reaching more of the people who may not yet be in this conversation. And thank you for speaking to that. So I'm going to just throw my my contribution link in the chat one more time in case you missed it. I'll throw the Housing for All legislative table link in case you want to stay plugged in to the work we're doing to organize around this vision on Beacon Hill. And I think with that, you know, I'm going to call it a night and say thank you for joining us. I apologize we went over. I did my best to keep it to an hour, but it's a hard task. And I'm just grateful for all of you. I'm grateful for this opportunity to go back to Beacon Hill. Going to get sworn in on Wednesday. And, you know, I think the final thing I'll say is the goal has to be comprehensive action on housing this session. And in the previous two sessions, what has happened, and I skipped over my presentation quickly because I wanted to get to the convo, but in the previous two sessions, we haven't taken up housing as a topic in its own right. We've waited until the end of session with an economic development bill, and we've put pieces into a larger bill, and it's given the governor all the power to veto things he doesn't like. Certainly, one of the things I'm talking about with my colleagues is, can we have a big debate on all of the pieces of housing, from unhoused folks to homeowners, to rent stabilization, to transfer fees, from right to council, to eviction ceiling, and so many of these pieces. And can we do that early and do it with enough time to really get it done and have it stick? There's no guarantee that that will happen, but I think it's certainly something that is worth asking for. And I'm just grateful that you've all given me the opportunity to actually be in the room and be at the table to make those requests. And I'm going to continue doing all I can to bring you, to bring the grassroots, and to bring the people most impacted to the table to have their voice heard in the process. So that's it for me. I'm grateful for all of you. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year, everyone. Good night.